Nino,
Yes.
just to ask you, during the presentations, will this this screen be on? What I mean is this, the one that you have on right now.
It will be if we can do that if you're not using any PowerPoint deck or slides. But in the case of Professor Sinha, since she needs her slides
okay.
on, so we will temporarily.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
I just have 4 slides, you know, that's all.
Yeah.
And it's
yeah.
what I'm going to say. There's not much. Also, because she's such an unknown, I figured it would be useful for people to at least see what she looked like and a little bit more about her life then.
Yeah,
fascinating.
Nice.
Fascinating person.
Yeah. Benita, was it Harriet? We talked about this before. I forget. Was it Harriet Martineau who mentioned Ramabai?
No, it was Ramabai who mentions Harriet Martineau.
Okay. And I think if I'm not mistaken, Kartini also mentioned Ramabai.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
Were they contemporaries? What is Kartini's biography? I forget.
Kartini should be a couple of decades younger. Yeah.
Ramabai was writing sort of 50 years after Martineau, and so she had access to Martineau's writings on America. She in fact came across, because Ramabai also traveled to the US and wrote about the US, right? So that she had looked at Martineau's writings on particularly on the status of women.
Yeah.
So.
Do you remember? Do you recall when she died?
Who?
Ramabai.
Yeah, 1922.
Okay. So around the same time, I forget exactly when Kartini died, but it was around the same. But Kartini, of course, you know, she was extremely young. She was in her 20s when she died. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Ramabai lived into her 70s. She was 70 or 70. Passed away.
Yeah.
Just remarkable for the times, you know. Yeah. But anyway, it's good to have this. I mean, this is something we did in the book as well, trying to kind of cross conversations and dialogue that would be possible, you know, even if the thinkers themselves were not talking to each other, how we could kind of have them converse with each other on common themes and things like that. I mean, we did do some of that in the book, I remember.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but we actually could do more in terms of just concentrating on, interesting just to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll begin in a minute, professors.
Yeah. Okay.
We're good, sir. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. The Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the Anthropological and Sociological initiatives of the Ateneo, which is the DSA's Research and Public Sociology and Anthropology Initiative, welcome you to today's webinar entitled Alternative Sociologies, Counter-Sociologies, Jose Rizal and Pandita Ramabai Saraswati's contributions to sociological theory. I am Enrique Nino Pileviste, your webinar facilitator for this afternoon. We have 2 distinguished speakers this afternoon. They are prolific scholars who have taught and written extensively on a myriad of topics, most notably on the contributions of Global South social thinkers and reformers in decolonizing and deepening sociology. They are Professors Benita Sinha and Said Farid Alatas. Professor Sinha is head of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. She holds a master's in social science from the National University of Singapore and a master's of arts degree and a PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. Her research interests include Hindu religiosity in the diaspora, intersections of religion, commodification and consumption processes, interface of religion and materiality, religion-state encounters in colonial and post-colonial moments, formation of concepts and categories in the social sciences, Eurocentric and Androcentric critique of classical sociological theory, pedagogy, and innovating alternative teaching practices. Her publications range from A New God in the Diaspora, Muniswaran Worship of Asian in Contemporary Singapore, Religion and Commodification, Merchandising Diasporic Hinduism, Religion-State Encounters in Hindu Domains from the Straits Settlements to Singapore, Food, Foodways and Foodscapes, Culture, Community and Consumption in Post-Colonial Singapore, and Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, which she co-authored with Professor Alatas. In turn, Professor Alatas is Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. He also headed the Department of Malay Studies at NUS from 2007 till 2013. He lectured at the University of Malaya in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies prior to joining NUS. In the early 1990s, he was research associate at the Women and Human Resource Studies Unit, University Sains, Malaysia. Professor Alatas has authored numerous books and articles, including Ibn Khaldun, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of the Lost Tradition in Sociology, and as well with Professor Sinha, Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, and the State of Feminist Theory in Malaysia. He has written journal articles as well, and his areas of interest include sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra and interreligious dialogue, and the study of Orientalism. Before we begin, here are some house rules for our webinar participants. Kindly ensure that your microphones are turned off during the session, especially when speakers are presenting. We would also like to request participants to turn off their video cameras to conserve bandwidth. We encourage participants to engage with the speakers through the chat box. Note that we will only be able to accommodate a considerable number of questions in the interest of time. Please close any running notifications or apps to avoid experiencing internet disruptions or video lagging. Finally, please put your screen on speaker view as well. So at this juncture, we now invite Professor Sinha to give her presentation. Good afternoon, Professor.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear, Professor.
Okay, and can you see I'm sharing screen? I hope that's visible too.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, let me thank Dr. Leviste for inviting me to be a part of this very important and interesting conversation. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague and friend, Professor Syed Farid Alatas. We have been working together for the last several decades on this project, and we are very happy to see that there's tremendous interest in topics of Eurocentrism and androcentrism, which are the frames we have used to produce conceptions of alternative and counter-sociologies. So this afternoon, I want to talk about a relatively unknown figure. Her name is Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. The title of the talk is, Was She a Woman Ahead of Her Times? I encountered Ramabai quite by accident because, my exposure to sociological theory, both at the National University of Singapore and later on when I went on to do graduate studies, did not include, figures like Ramabai, not surprisingly. So my discovery of her existence was really quite accidental and serendipitous, but I'm very glad to have made her acquaintance. And what I want to do in the short 20 minutes that I have is try to familiarize you with who she was as a person, which I think is really important given how little is known about her outside of India, but even in India, she has a pretty hazy presence amongst social scientists. So I want to share a little bit about her biography and then also about the body of work that she produced and share with you some of the methods and her approach to theorizing society. So let me begin. So Pandita Ramabai Saraswati was born in 1858 in the Indian state of Maharashtra. Her father was a Brahmin scholar who was committed to the cause of female education, and he took it upon himself to teach his own young wife Lakshmibai as well as his daughter Ramabai Sanskrit and the Hindu scriptures, which was quite an unusual thing to do at the time. So Ramabai had no formal education, but was taught by both her parents and could recite the Hindu scriptures proficiently from a very young age. The wisdom that was imparted to her was largely religious rather than secular and very much textual. After her parents passed away relatively early in her life, she traveled across India with her brother, giving lectures in Sanskrit and engaging religious experts across India on a variety of social and spiritual matters. At the end of her travels, she arrived in the Indian city of Calcutta and spent a significant part of her adult creative life in this city. It was here that she was honored by the Brahmins of Calcutta with the title Pandita, which means eminent scholar and teacher. And this was on the basis of her knowledge of sacred Hindu texts. She was also seen as a modern day incarnation of the Hindu goddess of learning, Saraswati, and therefore the name Saraswati was included in her name. In addition to Sanskrit, she could read and write Marathi, Kannadese, Hindi, and Bengali, and of course, English. The conferring of the titles of Pandita and Saraswati on her subsequently produced the name by which she was to be remembered. Ramabai was very interested in studying medicine and turned to the Anglo-Indian community in India for support in actualizing this ambition, but unfortunately that never had happened. At the age of 22, Ramabai chose to marry a friend of her brother's, a lawyer by profession, and a man outside her caste community of Brahmins, thus breaking with convention even in her own life. She had a daughter from this marriage, but lost her husband to cholera the following year when their child was just 6 months old. So between 1882, when her husband died, and 1922, Ramabai was pretty much a single mother. In 1883, Ramabai left for England with her 2-year-old daughter. She enrolled at the Cheltenham Women's College to study the natural sciences, mathematics, and English. But as I said, her ambition was to qualify as a medical doctor. Unfortunately, her dream remained unrealized as she developed a deafness due to a health condition while in London. So to support herself in a foreign land, she taught Sanskrit and Marathi at the Cheltenham Female College to women missionaries who were planning to go to work in India. Within a few months of arriving in England, Ramabai had converted to Christianity. While in Pune, India, she had already been exposed to English missionaries and had expressed misgivings and disillusionment about Orthodox Hinduism. Unsurprisingly, her conversion created much controversy back in India. She was resoundingly criticized for rejecting her Hindu identity, even by some of her staunch admirers and supporters. After almost 4 years of studies in England, in 1886, she sailed to the USA to attend the ceremony of her distant relative. Can I be heard? Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, sorry, I thought I was muted. She traveled to the US to attend the graduation of her distant relative, Dr. Anandibai Joshi, who was considered the first Indian woman medical doctor at the University of Pennsylvania. So Ramabai, traveled a fair bit outside of India. She was in the US, as I said, she was in England, and then she returned to India to continue her work in 1889. And on her way back to India, she also visited China and Japan. And she died on 5th of April, 1922. So that's a kind of a very rough sort of outline of her life. Allow me to say a few words about her works. Now, the body of Ramabai's work is diverse and multidimensional. She has left a legacy of works, ideas, and contributions that require careful intellectual unpacking. Ramabai was a prolific writer, producing documents in the form of numerous books, pamphlets, lectures, brochures, newspaper articles, as well as her important testimony as a witness before the Hunter Education Commission. She also left religious writings in Hindi and Marathi, and her translation of the Bible from English to Marathi is very well known. In all of these writings, she offered an unyielding critique of Hindu orthodoxy, caste, and patriarchy, and argued that educating Indian women would culminate in raising the status of Hindu women. Her work also includes her efforts in building institutions for social reform and education of Indian women. Ramabai's overseas travels produced reflections about the places she visited and the culture she encountered. These writings document her observations about the society she encountered and embody her critique of slavery, racism, patriarchy, and institutionalized religion, including religious institutions in Christianity. And her comparative observations about the status of women in India and the USA are quite well known. So some prominent examples of her writings are shown on the screen here. She wrote mainly on women, women's education, famine, and religion. Of the titles that I've listed here, The High Caste Hindu Woman, which was published in 1889, remains one of her best known writings, in which she makes a case for rescuing Indian women from the excesses of orthodoxy that they encounter in their everyday lives. The second book that I want to flag from the screen is the book, The Peoples of the United States, which was also published in 1889. Originally, it was written in Marathi, and then only actually a century later, a century later, it was translated into English. Ramabai was quite a prolific writer. She, as you can see, she wrote a great deal, but in addition to writing, she also was very much an activist and undertook lives in Mumbai. So she set up various institutions for teaching and women, and she set up a school for widows and school for women, etc. So she was, her work really is quite broad, and I think it's really important to expand, in when we are looking at women or other thinkers like Ramabai, that we have a very broad understanding of what we mean by work, and not just be reductionist in thinking that the work that they have refers only to writings. Right? So in that sense, Ramabai was as much an institution builder, but not here talking about academic institutions, but the other institutions which have really left a legacy in the Indian context, and many of them continue. So Ramabai's life and work reveal an explicit and engaged social reformist tone. A primary concern was the status of women, in particular, the status of high caste Hindu women, whose lives, she argued, were constrained by a highly rigid and patriarchal social arrangement. She was distinct amongst her contemporaries for her direct critique of patriarchy, its ideologies and institutions. She challenged long-held discriminatory social and cultural practices and their debilitating effect on girls. So she wrote against the institution of child marriage for girls, practice of enforced widowhood, and remarriage, as well as very serious restrictions on education of young girls. Her rallying call encouraged women to be self-reliant, urging them to lead self-reliant and independent lives. I think I will not be able to go into the details, but I just wanted to give you a feel of the kind of work that she produced, or at least, how I unpacked her work to include both institutions as well as, writings that we have now. I wanted to move now to say a little bit about the method, because part of the logic of the project that Farid and I were involved in was to really try and articulate a methodical approach that the various thinkers had towards studying their own and other societies, right? So the point we want to make is that there was a method and a logic to the approach that the various thinkers we have included in our project adopted in studying different societies. So allow me to say a few words about Ramabai's method. Now, Ramabai was a social thinker and reformer who valued and advocated freedom of thought and action and worked tirelessly so that equality and progress could be achieved for Hindu women. Ramabai's work is approached here in this project first and foremost as social commentary. She offered a scathing critique of her present as well as of the blind spots existing in religious dogma and social norms. She further identified the causes of these phenomena and conceptualized alternative social structures for a better progressive future. This future, she argued, would materialize only through concerted efforts, collective and institutional. The commentary and critique of society is, I argue, a method that is carried in the substantive body of Ramabai's work, which is also marked by self-reflexivity on her part. So this reading of her work suggests strongly that her diagnosis of the problem, say, of the high caste Hindu woman was rooted in a recognition of structural factors and assumed that the problematic of women's oppression could be alleviated. So Ramabai highlighted education and, in this case, lack of education for women, morality and religious orthodoxy and dogma in diagnosing societal problems, in particular the status of women. The remedies she proposed were educational reforms and cultivating and disciplining the individual mind. Broadly, she argued that it was concerted human actions and the individual capacity to exercise freedom that would engender change through individual, collective, and institutional interventions. I've also argued that her work can be productively interpreted through feminist frames. Ramabai did not invoke what would be recognizable as feminist terminology today, but I argue that in intent and intention, she sought to bring about concrete changes in the status of women, recognizing their oppression and subordination. So Ramabai uses, in addition to social commentary, she also uses, what has been called the life history method or the autobiographical method, which are well-established modes of inquiry in qualitative research. The logic in this mode of research is grounded in approaching a range of empirical material like interview data, letters, diaries, memoirs, autobiographical narratives, and visual images as documents from which one can read the intimate connections between individual and the social. So Ramabai, uses in her analysis, she invokes her own life narrative and experiences and stories of those around her to present persuasively the situation of Hindu women in India and to enlist support for her specific social reform projects. So a scrutiny of autobiographical narratives that Ramabai uses reveals her to be intensely self-reflexive. In her memoirs, she dissected her personal experiences and the life events that produced the person that she became, but also in the process, she isolated the role of various structural factors. For example, social norms about gender, existing religious orthodoxy and dogma, the denial of educational opportunities for women as structural factors which impacted individual lives. So Ramabai's views on education, child marriage, and treatment of widows were mediated by her biographical experiences as well as that of her mother and other prominent and lay women around her. And so I think her approach is really quite interesting because she provides a social commentary using the autobiographical life history method. And as one scholar who's worked considerably on Ramabai notes that for Ramabai, social analysis of this kind was both a precondition and a means of social reform. So I think it's important to recognize that, of course, over time, in sociological theory, the social reform agendas have been marginalized from the core discourse, right? And this has produced the false dichotomy of pure and applied research. So scholars have argued that, analysis of society and reform were not alienated for Ramabai, but they were integrally related. In this, her position was aligned with those of other classical sociological thinkers, as well as Florence Nightingale and Harriet Martineau and Binoy Kumar Sarkar, whom we also include in this project, as well as Jose Rizal. In fact, echoes of Durkheim's and Martineau's theorizing reverberate strongly in Ramabai's attention to how analysis has to lead to social reform. So let me now sort of, because time is short, I wanted to flag one particular aspect of Ramabai's sociological insight, and these are the comparative sociological insights that Ramabai has produced in the book, The Peoples of the United States, which was originally published in Marathi in 1889. So this book, The Peoples of the United States, has been described by Mira Kosambi, who's a biographer of Ramabai, as a critical ethnography of American society. The text was conceived while Ramabai was still in the USA, where she observed at close range different facets of American life. But the book was published after she returned to India and only translated into English more than a century after its first publication. So crafted for an Indian audience, the text carried chapters on the system of government, the social and domestic conditions, the spheres of education, commerce and industry, politics and religion, as well as the status of women in American society. So I want to flag two, areas that were very crucial in Ramabai's comparative sociology. One is the condition and status of women in the US, which she actually compares with the status of women in India as well as in Britain. And also she was very interested in religion in the American, the British, and the Indian context. So this book, I would argue, is an atypical narrative. Mira Kosambi, who translated the book into English, gives it a different title. The title is Returning the American Gaze, Situating Pandita Ramabai's American Encounter. So this narrative, I argue, is an atypical narrative for the times, which simultaneously achieves several reversals. It offers a post-Orientalist perspective through an Indian scrutinizing American culture. It showcases the emergence of the female and feminist gaze upon the Occident, and it stands out as a rare commentary by a colonized subject, a woman with feminist leanings on a Western society in the mid-19th century, which is quite remarkable for its times. Of course, we know that interest in America during these years was intense in Europe as well as in non-Europe. We know that the French aristocrat and scholar Alexis de Tocqueville and the British social thinker Harriet Martineau were prominent observers of American life in the early decades of the 19th century. So Ramabai joins this group of thinkers who were interested in making sense of American society, which seemed to be such a contrast to both colonized world at the time as well as colonizing centers in Europe. I see that I've run out of time. I was given 20 minutes. So let me stop there. I just want to say, that in relation to this book, The Peoples of the United States, the book would currently hold a different resonance in the context of post-colonial, post-Orientalist, and postmodernist debates and discourses that could not have dictated Ramabai's depiction of American society, right? So within the context of our project, reading Ramabai comparatively in this manner reveals, that she was really possibly very ahead of her times in anticipating, the Orientalists and the post-colonial critique that have, come many decades, if not more than a century after Ramabai's own lifetime. And for this reason, I do hold that she was a woman ahead of her times. So let me stand down and thank you very much for listening. I hope I'll have a few minutes to offer some concluding remarks on Ramabai later on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinha, for that insightful presentation. We will get back to you certainly in a bit. At this point, we would now like to invite Professor Alatas to share his insights about Jose Rizal's contribution to sociological theory. Professor Alatas, good afternoon. Professor, you're muted at the moment.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Levista, for the invitation. It's my second time here, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak to you about the issue of dealing with or going beyond Eurocentric sociology. But in particular, I'm very glad to be able to speak to you about Rizal. My presentation is really about discussion of a structure that forms the basis of the elaboration of the social thought of Rizal. So I'm going to say something about Rizal's thought, but I want to talk more about a structure that we can use in order to reconstruct social theory using Rizal as the example. Now for the purpose of this discussion, I'm concentrating on one specific aspect of Rizal's thought, which is the sociology of colonial society. And the structure that is used to articulate this sociology calls for the systematic discussion of Rizal's subject matter, the problematic, the methods, the objectives, and the sources. So this is what I'm going to cover. Now, obviously, Rizal is not seen as a founder or a precursor of sociology, not even in our part of the world, not even in Southeast Asia or the Malay world. Although, and this is the main point, a sociology can be seen in his work. Now, just to provide a background to the discussion, the issue, of course, is what we mean by Eurocentrism, and from there we can understand what is meant by decolonial sociology, or the whole idea of decolonizing sociology and decolonizing knowledge production in general, and of course, in particular, using Rizal as an exemplar or an example of decolonizing knowledge production. Now, I'm defining Eurocentrism as the study of phenomena from a European perspective in such a manner that that perspective silences or distorts those phenomena or elements thereof. Let me just repeat that. Eurocentrism is the study of phenomena from a European perspective in such a manner that that perspective silences or distorts those phenomena or elements thereof. So I'm not suggesting that any European perspective is Eurocentric. I guess what I'm saying is that there are European perspectives that are legitimate, that do not result in silencing of other voices or in the distortion of realities. Now, let me just give an example of what I mean by all of this. If you, you consider today, this is 2020. Now, since last year, up until I think 2021, yeah, from 2019 to 2021, many parts of the world, many countries in the world are commemorating and celebrating the circumnavigation of the world by Magellan, Ferdinand Magellan. And this, of course, is very pertinent to the Philippines. Now, here you have a classic case of Eurocentrism, because in this whole story of the circumnavigation of the globe, you have a distortion and marginalization. You have kind of silencing going on. You have this global network of Magellan cities, which consists of a few cities around the world. I think altogether 25 cities, including Lisbon, Seville, Puerto de San Julian, Puerto de Santa Cruz in Argentina, some cities, a city in Uruguay, in Chile, and Cebu also is in the Philippines, is included in this, Tidore in Indonesia, and so on. And this is to commemorate the the trip of Magellan around in his attempt to go around the globe. You have in Spain and Portugal many activities, including traveling, exhibitions, the preparation of a joint study between the two countries, an international conference on oceans, knowledge, and globalization, and so on and so forth. Now, in all of these cases, or in most of these cases, what is interesting is that you have two silences going on, all right? The whole story is about Magellan's going around the globe, his so-called discovery of the Philippines, and in the process, the silencing of the fact that he was killed by Lapu-Lapu. Of course, Lapu-Lapu, the native chieftain of Mactan, where Magellan arrived. The story of Lapu-Lapu, of course, is told, but the way it is told is interesting. Magellan's arrival is seen as a discovery, and in fact, many authors up until the early part of the 20th century even referred to the area as the Magellan Archipelago. And the fact that Lapu-Lapu's killing of Magellan and his the crew was not seen as an anti-colonial resistance. So I think this is quite interesting. There's a kind of silencing that was going on. The other silencing has to do with the Malay navigator that was probably actually the first to have gone around the world. Now you have interesting silencing there because in the sense that there's very little information given about the Malay navigator. The fact that he was crucial to the navigation because he knew the seas in this part of the world. The fact that he was a translator for the Spanish and Portuguese for the European crew, consisting mainly of Spaniards and Portuguese, but also consisting of the famous Italian travel writer Antonio Pigafetta. And the silencing is also in terms of the fact that nobody tells us the Malay navigator's name. He's referred to as a slave, and the name that is given to us is Enrique in Portuguese or Enrique in Spanish, also known in English as Henry the Black in many of the sources, but nobody knows his Malay name. And in general, the story is that Magellan, and if not Magellan, it was Elcano, one of the crew members of the expedition, who eventually made it back to Spain, were the ones who circumnavigated the globe and not the Malay navigator. So you can imagine, the fact, the resilience of Eurocentrism in the sense that we are still commemorating Magellan and celebrating Magellan, and with the exception of perhaps the Philippines, Lapu-Lapu remains unknown or understudied or ignored or silenced, and the same thing goes with Henrique with Enrique, whose real name we don't even know. Now, what this suggests is that a major trait of Eurocentrism is the what I call the subject-object dichotomy. The non-European are not subjects. They're not knowing subjects. They don't have agency. So Henry the Black, Enrique has no name. He's silenced. He's not a knowing subject. He's merely an object of history. And the same thing goes for the as far as the whole process of knowledge production is concerned. So in general, in the disciplines, in sociology, for example, Jose Rizal is not a subject. He is almost totally ignored in practically any discipline. Where he is studied, of course, is in Philippine studies, in people who are interested in the study of the Philippines and history of the Philippines. But as far as any of the disciplines are concerned, Rizal is generally not a knowing subject. The whole purpose of engaging in this reconstruction of Rizal's social theory is to restore his position as his status as a knowing subject. Now, as I said earlier, I wanted to discuss a structure that could be used to reconstruct Rizal's social thought. Now, the structure is really quite simple. The structure calls for our identifying a topic. It calls for our identifying a problematic. It calls for our identifying a method and an ultimate objective of the scholar in question, of the thought of the scholar in question. So in the case of Rizal's thought, there are of course many topics that are covered by Rizal, but an overall topic that we can identify is the study of colonial society. And Rizal's problem, his problematic, when he looks at colonial society, is to understand the nature of colonial society, which he regarded as backward, and to look into the causes of the backwardness of colonial society. Now, the answer to that question, what is the nature of colonial society, and what are the causes of its backwardness? The answer to that question would be what we can refer to as Rizal's theory of colonial society, his analysis of colonial society. Now, it's interesting that the entire theory, Rizal's entire theory of colonial society proceeds from one premise. As far as I can see, there is one premise, there's one statement which acts as a premise from which his entire theory can be deduced. And that premise is this. I'm reading it out. The miseries of a people without freedom should not be imputed to the people, but to their rulers. I repeat, the miseries of a people without freedom should not be imputed to the people, but to their rulers. So Rizal's point was that he accepted Filipino society was backward. He accepted there was indolence in the sense that there was a lack of love for work. He accepted that there was poverty, there was illiteracy, there was a lack of initiative. Filipinos were preoccupied with gambling, with all kinds of vices. So he accepted that the overall backwardness of Filipino society. But his point was, and this is the starting point, was that because Filipinos were not free, their backwardness could not be blamed on they themselves, but on their rulers. Now, that is his premise. That's his assumption. In order to prove that that was the case, he had, in other words, in order to prove that the problem of backwardness of Filipino society was not to be found in Filipino society itself, but rather should be blamed on their rulers. He had to prove that prior to colonial rule, the Filipinos were indeed were not backward, right? So that made him go to history. So the task, he had to go back to history. He had to look at the state of Filipino society in order to show that they were, prior to colonial rule, an advanced society. So, but in order to do that, he had to rewrite history, because all the, most of the histories of the Philippines were written by friars and by other, Spaniards, many of them colonial administrators. So he had to go back to the historical works written by the Spaniards. He also looked at the works of other writers, historians, travel writers, including Antonio Pigafetta. He had to go back to these works, but his task in going back to history and rewriting history, it wasn't an end in itself, right? He wasn't interested in history for its own sake. He was interested in history in order to critique the colonial discourse, because the colonial discourse suggested that Filipinos were inherently backward, and hence the need for colonialism, the need for, for the Spaniards to play a civilizing role. Rizal accepted that there was backwardness, but he disagreed with the Spaniards as to what the causes of that backwardness was. Now, when Rizal went back to history, he discovered that Filipinos were active. They were shipbuilders. They controlled trading routes. They had, formed empires and so on and so forth. So, you know very well, his annotation of De Morga's history of the Philippine Islands. In that annotation, he engages in a reconstruction of Filipino history, and he shows that Filipinos prior to colonization were an advanced people. Then he comes back to contemporary society, to the Philippines of his time, to the colonial society of his time, and given his having proved that Filipinos prior to colonization were advanced, he shows that there are various factors in colonial society due to colonial rule and colonial administration, which are the real causes of Filipino backwardness. He looks at the feudal-like system, the system of the encomenderos, the encomendias, the system in which land is held by landowners, friars and other Spaniards, and which deprives the Filipinos themselves of the best land. So there's exploitation in that sense. There's forced labor. There is arbitrary rule by an arbitrary bureaucracy. There is the introduction of gambling by the colonial state, which results in Filipinos, being distracted and losing money. There is, as I said, forced labor, which removes the incentive for Filipinos to work, because at any time they may be called to work for colonial administrators. And he also notes something quite interesting. He says that there's also the phenomenon of the desire of the ruled to be like the rulers. So he suggests that the rulers, the Spaniards, the friars, dislike work. They were in fact indolent, and this indolence, this dislike for work was, something which was imitated by the ruled. In a sense, he was echoing what Ibn Khaldun said a few hundred years before him, that the vanquished like to imitate the lifestyle of the rulers. So Rizal went into the all these aspects of colonial society in order to show that it was colonial rule that contributed to the backwardness of the Filipinos. And perhaps his most famous work in this regard is the essay, The Indolence of the Filipinos, which first appeared in various parts in La Solidaridad, the fortnightly newspaper of the propaganda movement in Spain, for which Rizal wrote for several years. This was a systematic treatment of the whole idea of indolence, critiquing the colonial discourse on Filipino indolence. So Rizal's sociology of colonial society, his theory consists of, first of all, going back to history to reconstruct the nature of Filipino society in pre-colonial times, and then to come back to colonial society, the colonial society of his time, to inquire into the real reasons, what he understood to be the real reasons for the backwardness of colonial society, and then on that basis to speak about emancipation. The whole idea of emancipation, for which I think there's a lot of controversy about whether Rizal was for reform within the context of Spanish colonial rule, as opposed to break away from colonial rule, as opposed to revolution. I tend to be on the side, of those who suggest that Rizal was for more than just reform, that he was for revolution, he was for independence from Spain. And this question of independence was not merely a question of political and economic freedom. There was also a transcendental dimension to this emancipation. The whole idea of paradise, fall, and redemption, and which in a way corresponds to pre-colonial Philippines, paradise, colonial Philippine, which is fall, and then independence, which is redemption. And I think the fact that, for example, the transcendental dimension to emancipation, one of them, of course, being the actual title of his first novel, No Limit Tangere, which of course, alludes to the words spoken by Christ to Am I back?
Yes, you are, Professor.
Okay. So I was saying that the title of Rizal's novel, No Limit Tangere, which means "touch me not," which refers to the word spoken by Christ to Mary Magdalene when Christ was resurrected. That itself, I think, suggests that in Rizal's mind there was that transcendental dimension to emancipation. So the structure of Rizal's theory, you have the reconstruction of history to make a point about the relative advancement of Filipino society prior to colonial rule. Then the study of the nature of colonial society, of colonial rule, its backward aspects that Rizal understood as the causes of Filipino backwardness. And he looked at colonial administration, he looked at the friars, he looked at taxes, at different forms of economic exploitation. and he examined the discourse. Apart from looking at those material aspects, he examined the discourse on Filipino laziness. He sort of, in today's terms, deconstructed the Spanish colonial discourse on laziness. And finally, he talked about emancipation. Now, I just in the last couple of minutes, let me talk about Rizal's method and sources. Now, Rizal's method, I think his methods are very interesting. And by methods, I'm not referring to methods of data collection. I'm referring to methods of argumentation. Now, in modern science, we recognize one method, basically, what we call demonstration, which consists of induction and deduction. And Rizal certainly did resort to induction and deduction. As I said, his whole sociology of colonial society proceeds from one premise. His theory is deduced from one premise. Then when he goes back to history, he engages in induction in the sense that he collects a lot of material, a lot of information, which he uses then to form an impression about the nature of pre-colonial society. So there you have induction. But Rizal, unlike many modern sociologists, Rizal also resorts to poetics. Poetics, I think, is a very interesting method. It's a method of making a truth claim. Unlike induction and deduction, which makes truth claims based on appeal to facts, poetics is a method of argumentation that appeals to the truth through stirring the imagination, right? Through the use of allegory, through the use of metaphor, through the use of satire. And Rizal does this in a lot of his writing, certainly in the two novels, El Filibusterismo and Malimitangere. You have the use of various allegories. You have the use of various characters in his novels being symbolic orientations that can be found in 19th century colonial society. For example, Ibarra, the Ilustrado, somewhat a captive mind who can't get himself to go against the Spaniards, although he has an aversion to colonial rule. You have Elias, who I think really represents Rizal's way of thinking, who is perhaps more morally unambiguous with regard to colonial rule. You have Tasio, the philosopher, which we could say represents the rational Rizal, the anti-scholastic, anti-Thomist dimension of Rizal, and so on and so forth. And then you have, the use of satire by Rizal. In fact, in one of the first, in the first essay, Reflections of a Filipino, in Rizal's political and historical writings, he uses a lot of satire. He talks about, for example, he says, what are the advantages of being anti-friar? And he says, nothing really. The more I analyze the thing, the more I find it silly and imprudent. This thing of struggling so that the country may progress, the country will progress if it can, and if it cannot, no. Moreover, what do I care if the coming generations would enjoy more or less freedom than I? And so on and so forth, right? So the whole essay, is a satirical reflection on whether it's good to be anti-friar or not. And I found it quite effective, in fact. You have Rizal using both induction, deduction, what we call the scientific method, as well as poetics. What I haven't looked at is Rizal's use of rhetoric. In the classical, medieval Christian, but the ancient Greek and also Islamic traditions, 4 methods of argumentation were recognized: demonstration, which is induction and deduction, poetics, rhetoric, and dialectics. And I think if we were to return to a way of thinking and researching and writing that employed more than just induction and deduction. It would make us, methodologically more pluralistic, and I think more creative. So methodologically, I think this is a good lesson that we can learn from Rizal. Now, I'm just going to end by talking about Rizal's sources. Now, Rizal, I'm interested in reconstructing Rizal's social theory. Interestingly, his sources are not sociology. There's hardly, I don't know of any sociological source that Rizal resorted to, but his sources were actually history and anthropology. His sources were history, and more specifically ethnologies and ethnographies. And they were not Spanish, ethnographies or Spanish ethnologies. They were mainly the works of German and German-speaking anthropologists, ethnographers, and ethnologists, linguists, and so on. And the point is, Rizal didn't engage much in anthropological research. He didn't do much ethnographies. There are some, he has some, descriptions of Filipino folklore, linguistics. He looked at Tagalog versification, and he made a presentation to German anthropologists on Tagalog versification. But overall, he didn't do much research by way of what we would today call anthropology. But he certainly benefited in a very big way from ethnographies and ethnological studies, which we can see in his history. When he looks at history, he's not looking at dates and chronology. He's not looking at the great men of history. He's looking at the nature of Filipino society in the past. So you could say it's a kind of historical ethnology or historical ethnography. And Rizal was also, because of his contact with the German anthropologists, who happened not to buy into the racist hierarchical views of human societies, who were critical of the French de Gobineau's racist theories of human society. Rizal used their ideas to counter Spanish views about Filipino inferiority. So in that sense, Rizal, and he wrote about it. And so in that sense, Rizal was among the first in our region, I think, to critique the 19th century racist views that developed in early anthropology. Rizal was, but Rizal came a few decades after the Haitian anthropologist Ateneo, who was probably the first to critique the Gobineau and this kind of racist understanding of of the classifying the human civilization into various races according to a hierarchy of from superior to inferior. But Rizal was certainly among the first and probably the first in our region. Rizal's sources of his sociology were not sociology; they were anthropology and history. So I think, just to end, the whole task, I think, of going beyond the critique of Eurocentrism in the social sciences is to not just talk about the problem. I agree we should talk about the problem because people need to be conscientized, and there needs to be, and we need to speak not only to ourselves and to our generation, but also to the, the next generation. But beyond that, we need to actually do perform the task of reconstructing ideas, of, finding new concepts, of reconstructing the thought of exemplars like Rizal, Ibn Khaldun, Ramabai, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, and the thinkers that we covered in our book, and many other thinkers in our region that have not been seriously looked at along these lines, such as Raden Ajeng Kartini, Tan Malaka, Pramudia Anantatur, and so on and so forth. So we need to engage in the task of reconstruction, to teach along these lines, rewrite the textbooks, so that in the next or generation after the next, we will no longer be talking about the need to decolonize knowledge, because the task would have already been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alatas, for a comprehensive discussion of Rizal's work and how it contributes eventually to the deepening and the decolonizing of sociology, the global stage. This is an opportunity for us now to extend this conversation to our audience. And as I look through the chat box, we already have several interesting questions, which I think would ignite more discussion. To begin, let me first read a question from Mastura Alatas. I'm pretty sure it's related to you, Professor. And the question is particularly addressed to Professor Sinha. Do people study Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States and Ramabai's The Peoples of the United States together? Two books written almost a century apart. Does Zinn himself refer to Ramabai's book?
Right. Thank you. Hi, Matsura. Thank you so much for the question. Well, actually, Ramabai herself, even her own book has been hardly studied by social scientists. So as far as I know, Howard Zinn's book, which was 1939, has not been read alongside Ramabai's work. But interestingly, Ramabai herself knew about Harriet Martineau's work on American society, as well as Tocqueville's work on American society. And so Ramabai refers to Martineau's account of American society, in particular, her Martineau's discussion on the status of women in the US. So I think, the question you raise is an important one, and this is something that Farid and I have also tried to do a little bit in the book, which is to contemplate, what are the conversations that we can have across these different thinkers, either those who were sort of living at the same time or separated by decades or even a century, right? What kinds of knowledges were being produced if one were to take into account other prior work that had been done on a particular topic. So I'm personally very interested in trying to bring into conversation Ramabai's text on the US with other commentators, both her contemporaries and those who came before her. And I think the comparison will, of course, yield, what are the kind of distinct analysis that they offered, because they clearly did not agree and converge on many issues. And in fact, the status of women in America has been debated. If you look at Tocqueville's statement on what was the condition of women in American society, I mean, he kind of has a very positive spin on it. Whereas, if you read Harriet Martineau's text, which was written almost exactly at the same time as Tocqueville, perhaps separated by a decade, Martineau's account of American women was really quite negative, and she noticed that there were parallels between how women were treated and how slaves were treated in American society. And on the chat, I had seen another question about, what was Ramabai's assessment of American society? Well, her assessment was very positive, actually. So, her views on American society were more aligned with Tocqueville's views rather than with Martineau's views. But she explains the difference as well in her book and says that, Martineau wrote 60 years before me, so then their situation was really bad. But, I'm writing in 1889, and so their lot has really improved. So in Ramabai's own narrative, we see sort of both a positive portrayal of say, women's status in American society, but also a critique of it, right? She was quite aware that women were not treated as equal and things like that. So maybe I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sinha. Another question that is now addressed to Professor Alatas would be a question from Kunal Sadwani, and it has something to do with Jose Rizal. The question goes, one thing that really got me thinking is if you believe that Lee Kuan Yew's approach in achieving the ultimate goal of independence from the British and separation from Malaysia closely mirrors the approach of Rizal's sociological theory and theory of colonial society. So are there similarities, Professor Alatas, or are there convergences? Professor?
We just connected again, sir.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I lost the connection.
No problem, Professor.
Okay.
There is a particular question addressed to you from Kunal Sadwani. The question basically revolves around points of convergence between Rizal's approach as reflected in his sociological theory and theory of colonial society, as well as Lee Kuan Yew's approach in achieving the ultimate goal of independence from the British and separation from Malaysia. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I'm not really, I don't really understand why the question is about Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people around the world thought about, freedom from colonial rule, right? There's nothing remarkable about that. But what is remarkable about Rizal was that he was one of the first systematic thinkers to think about the nature of colonial society, to think about the nature of colonial rule, to deal systematically with, various problems of colonial discourse. And not only that, he was not an armchair, what you call an armchair theoretician. He was also a practitioner. He was an activist, and he accomplished so much for the very few years that he was in this world. So I mean, there's no comparison with Lee Kuan Yew. They lived in different times. Obviously, Lee Kuan Yew was not a radical. And I don't think we can identify an original, social thought in Lee Kuan Yew's work or thought in the same way that we have attempted to do for Rizal. In a sense, it's comparing apples and origins, apples and oranges.
Thank you, Professor. A follow-up question to you, Professor, about Rizal. There is a question regarding his sociological orientation, and the participant is asking, why do you think Rizal did not express as articulately and explicitly in sociological writings his ideas about colonial society? You said that history and anthropology were his major influences, right? What do you think somehow barred him from exploring the sociological dimension or the sociological aspect of his analysis?
Well, first of all, it must have something to do with the fact that anthropology was more of an established discipline in his time than sociology. It also has to do with the fact that the circles that he moved around in were tended to be people who were studying, doing ethnographies, people who were interested in ethnolinguistics, and these were largely the people that he came in, actually in Germany, with German or German-speaking scholars. They were not only anthropologists, but many of them were. And even if they were not anthropologists, they may have been linguists, they may have been geographers. For example, Blumentritt was trained in geography, but he did ethnographic or ethnographic type work on the Philippines. So these were the kinds of people that Rizal came into contact with, and he was brought in Germany. He was brought into the circle of geographers, ethnographers, ethnologists, into not only into their circles informally, but also in terms of membership in professional societies like German. I don't remember the exact name of the society, but you had anthropological societies in Germany, which he joined and he addressed, he spoke to, and they had taken him very seriously. He was, considered as a serious scholar by them, and the fact that they gave him a very warm eulogy upon his execution, and attests to that. So I think he was drawn into that world. And furthermore, he was interested in the kinds of issues that anthropologists were, and not sociologists, because in his time, whatever sociology there was more interested in the study of the West rather than in the study of the colonies. I think maybe the earliest sociologists to actually do research on the colonies was the Dutch Schrijker, but that would have been slightly after Rizal's time. Schrijker is famous for his 2-volume Indonesian sociological studies. But in terms of the kind of sociology that was being done in Rizal's time, it was mainly concerned with the study of the West and not with colonial societies.
Okay, thank you, Professor Adatas. I have 2 questions for Professor Sinha. I think you reiterated this a while ago in your presentation, Professor Vinita, but it would be beneficial for those who just came in to probably reiterate how much of a feminist Pandita Ramabai Saraswati was, no? And what was her, shall we say, contributions to feminist theory? That's one. And secondly, what would be, there's a question about her travels, no? And if she developed, because of those travels, a systematic analysis of women's status or how women are treated in Asia vis-a-vis the West.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Let me take the question about feminism first. So, of course, Ramabai lived and wrote in the middle of the 19th century, and much of the language of feminism that became subsequently available to social scientists was not there at the time. But as I mentioned, I think in intent, she was certainly a feminist, and people who've read her works very carefully argue that she was absolutely critical of structures of authority, both in religious domains and both in Hindu and Christian quarters, as well as in society in general. So, she was very critical of patriarchy. She was very critical of authoritarianism and conservatism that she saw both in Orthodox Hinduism as well as in the Anglican Church, to which she had converted. So I would definitely say that there is feminist consciousness in Ramabai's work, and this is really evident in 3 of her earliest writings, The Cry of the Hindu Woman and High Caste Hindu Women, where different nuances of her feminist thinking are revealed. And I think her emergent feminist consciousness actually lies in the very naming of the problem of the high caste Hindu women, right? Her conceptualization of Indian women's oppression and the need for redress constitute her critique of patriarchal norms given in caste, religion, and convention-based gender discrimination. So I think, one of her enduring contributions to feminism and feminist scholarship is really the articulation and the naming of the problem, right? That women in society seem to be the particular focus of different kinds of constraints and refusals and denials of education, for example. In terms of, how she has been received by feminists, well, some feminists in the Indian context have embraced her and see her as a pioneering figure. But, she's overall been a pretty controversial figure in Indian circles, partly because of her embrace of Christianity. And that, I argue actually colors the way in which people have received her scholarship and her thinking. But I find her own writings on the status of women in India to be quite insightful, right? And not only does she name the problem faced by Indian women, she also proceeds to diagnose this and then offer a solution to the problem. And it has been noticed that, the way in which she talks about women's condition in the middle of the 19th century in India, carries very eerie similarities with the status of Indian women today. And, the cause that she makes for women to be autonomous and self-reliant, can be interpreted as a kind of consciousness raising that we, associate with radical feminists, in more contemporary times. So the kind of long answer to the question is that yes, I very much see shades of feminist consciousness and feminist thinking in Ramabai, given her critique, a blatant, explicit, and strong critique of patriarchy that she encountered. Enrique, do you want me to take the second question as well now?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, so in terms of her travels, right? She certainly traveled to various countries. The most amount of time she spent outside was actually in England and also in America. She only fleetingly was present in Japan and China, so she hasn't really produced any writings or reflections on that. But she certainly wrote about Britain and the status of women in Britain. And there was a comparative dimension to her work, and this we see in her book on her 1889 book on the peoples of the United States, where she does compare British society with American society with Indian society and offers a critique of colonial society, actually, right, in terms of engendering different kinds of inequalities and hierarchies. So she takes that head on. It's very interesting that when she arrives in England, she converts to Christianity, and there she's people try to restrain her. So she's told, for example, that she was teaching at the Cheltenham College for Women, but she wanted to also teach at the she wanted to teach men, and the superiors of the Anglican Church said to her that she cannot, as a woman, she should not be teaching men, right? She should not be taking on any male students, and she was quite appalled at that. And she sort of makes this statement that she's not about to accept the constraints imposed by the Anglican Church on her in Britain, just as she has fought to remove constraints in the Indian context, right? So she really definitely compares how women are treated in Britain, in India, and in the US. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Sinha. There is a participant who would like to ask Professor Alatas personally. So we would like to invite him or her to turn on his or her microphone and address Professor Alatas directly.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Professor,
loud and clear.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So my name is Chang, and I'm a scholar from Vietnam. And my question is actually addressed Professor Syed Farid and also Professor Sinha as well. So you mentioned in earlier presentations about the European-centric viewpoints. And I have to say that based on my experiences in both Vietnam and Europe, whenever I write a paper on sociology, I was required by my professors to cite European names, European theoretical frameworks. So sometimes scholars fall in the trap of having European-centric viewpoints unconsciously. Do you have any advice for that? How can we make sure that we are not citing or having any Eurocentric viewpoint? Thank you.
Should I?
Yes, please, Professor.
Yeah. You know, I think we should not confuse citing European scholars with being Eurocentric. Yeah. So, you know, this whole exercise of recovering non-Western thinkers like Rizal and Ramabai, reconstructing their thought or extracting a social thought from their works is important because we want to recover these lost voices or these marginalized voices. But at the same time, we're not saying that one should not be interested in the European thinkers like Marx and Weber and so on. And the idea is not to, you know, replace one ethnocentrism with another. You know, so what you need to do is, you know, when you're doing research, when you are engaged in theory building and concept formation, you need to take the best ideas from wherever they come from. And I think the highest level of creativity is if you're able to combine theoretical constructs and concepts, you know, from a certain non-Western tradition with those from the Western tradition. You know, the analogy that I always use is from cooking, right? A good chef, you know, sitting in, let's say in the Philippines, a good chef is not going to say to himself that I'm only going to use herbs and spices that come from my country. I have no interest in herbs and spices that come from abroad, that come from Indonesia, or that even come from Latin America or the West, right? A good chef has an objective to, and he's going to be using all kinds of techniques, all kinds of methods, and all kinds of herbs and spices wherever they come from. That's what we want to do in knowledge in creation, in the whole process of knowledge creation, to be creative in that way.
All right, thank you, Professor. Professor Sinha, your thoughts?
I mean, of course, I think Farid has expressed it very well. I mean, I don't think that, I think one needs to take a very nuanced approach to identifying Eurocentrism, and I don't think we want to resort to any kind of nativism where we reject everything that comes from Europe. I think that would be very, very unproductive. I think, you know, one of the interesting skills to learn is how do we actually identify nuanced thinking regardless of where it comes from or who it's coming from, right? And I think it's also very important to understand that the binary of non-West and West, or non-Europe and Europe, is not a geographical or spatial binary, right? This is an epistemic category, right? I mean, it's really, it should not be sort of literally taken as, you know, a European perspective is reflected by people from Europe, right? Because Eurocentrism is a perspective and can be adopted by anyone, right? We know a lot of people in our midst in non-European contexts who are very, very Eurocentric, right? So I think it's really important to understand that. And, you know, the parallel would be to talk about androcentrism, right? Male-centeredness has nothing to do with men, you know, expressing this perspective. You know, women can be androcentric too, right? So I think it is important not to take notions of Eurocentrism and androcentrism literally and begin to map this onto, you know, in the case of Eurocentrism, onto spaces or places, right? And in the case of androcentrism, onto men and women. I think that would be very reductionist way of looking at things.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We are down to 2 questions, and I think we will attempt to wrap up our conversation before I give you space to give your concluding remarks. There are two questions here which are addressed to both of you. But what I can do is probably address one to any one of you, right? Question by Nikki Gregorio. Apart from the works of non-Western scholars like Ramabai and Rizal, and apart from engaging them in class discussion as part of the syllabus, what is your advice as far as contributing to post-colonial knowledge production? So anyone can answer, basically.
Right. Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, I mean, I think, you know, the inclusion of women and non-Western thinkers, you know, like Ramabai and Rizal and Khaldun and others in the project of decolonizing knowledge production is itself a huge step forward, right? I mean, I think, you know, it's really important to recognize that we have heard the critique of the social sciences, right? For at least 7 to 8 decades now. This critique is not new by any means, right? We've heard this over and over again. You know, at every generation we hear the call to decolonize being renewed, and I think it's an important moment when that happens. And but you know, the translation of that critique into practice has taken much longer to arrive. And in fact, in many cases, it is still non-existent, right? So I think what needs to happen is not just studying the works of non-Western scholars like Ramabai and Rizal, and in-class discussions, but it's what one is saying about them that's really crucial, right? So how are these works engaged, right? I certainly don't, you know, sort of take the approach that one should just add a few women thinkers and a few non-Western thinkers into the mix, and there you have it, right? It's not. It's a kind of a careful, nuanced, thoughtful, you know, engagement with the works of these thinkers who have been silenced, who have been marginalized, and sort of, you know, bringing them to the forefront in engaging them in meaningful conversations alongside other thinkers that we think of as legitimate you know, founders of the discipline of sociology, right? So for me, it's not just about including Ramabai or Rizal, but it's how do you include Ramabai, right? What do you say about them? How do you approach her? I mean, do you think of her simply as a woman writer? Do you think of her simply as a native writer, right? I think one needs to problematize these categories as well. Yeah, so I think if we can do that, right, and kind of address their contributions alongside the contributions of others. Ramabai was not writing in a vacuum, and she was very much aware of it. She was not an academic at all by any stretch of the imagination, but she was aware of you know, the discourse around her. She was engaging in that, and I think, you know, we need to look at Ramabai's contributions within the context of her times. And how she was entering particular kinds of intellectual debates that were ongoing. So for me, it's not just about including, and if someone does include Ramabai and Rizal, I think that's already a huge, you know, achievement to make. I would like to see more people doing that. For the sake of time, I'm not going to say much more and hand it over to Farid.
Thank you, Professor Sina. Professor Alatas, would you like to say
Yeah.
something about that? Okay.
Yeah. Well, in addition to what Benita said, I would also suggest that we do at least two things, you know, beyond our academic work, you know, in teaching and writing. I think we should also talk to the public. You know, we should engage in a kind of public, you know, sociology to conscientize at least the educated public about the problem of coloniality, the continuing coloniality in the world today, the way we think, and the need to decolonize. I think the fact that, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and even before that, you had at least in the context of the US and the UK, you had a great deal of discussion beyond the campuses on the problem of decolonization, and that was related to very real life issues, you know, such as, you know, for example, the the controversies over the Confederate statues in the U.S. And in fact, there was a whole series of events in the U.S. and the U.K. Also in South Africa. Maybe that was the most iconic case in South Africa. The movement to bring down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and that spread to other parts of the world. And even in the context of Singapore, the discussion on the Raffles statue or the statue of Francis Light in Penang, this whole idea of glorification of the colonial master is something that has been discussed beyond the campuses. And I think, so the public knows about these things, but I think it has to be related. They should understand that it's related. Such practical issues of, why do we care about Raffles or Sir Francis Light? Why do we care about Cecil Rhodes? Why do we glorify them? Those issues have to be related for the public. It should be related to the wider problem of coloniality of knowledge production and the need to decolonize knowledge. So I think many of us, it would be good if we could engage the public, through writing for media, speaking at not just to academics, but beyond academia. The other problem, very quickly, I want to say is the really big problem are the politicians, right? You see, in many of our countries, certainly the case in my country, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and I think it's the same in the Philippines. The universities, most of the universities are controlled by the ministries of education. And the ministries of education have very little interest in the problem of decolonizing knowledge. In fact, they're actually behind, they are the culprits behind inserting our university systems into global academia, which is basically a very Eurocentric global academia. They have inserted us into the global ranking systems and so on and so forth. So it's paradoxical that in our own countries, I know this is the case in Malaysia, I know this is the case in Indonesia, people are reluctant to publish in their own languages because you're not rewarded for publishing in your own languages, in Malay or Indonesian, because there are hardly any journals which are in Malay or Indonesian. And I'm sure that it's probably the same thing as far as Tagalog is concerned, which are highly ranked, and therefore you don't get as much credit for publishing in those languages in your local journals as you do for publishing in international journals. So until the reward system is changed or is altered, we're not going to be able to resolve such problems. And it requires not only our pushing, but it also requires changes in policies, right? So maybe that's something we can do, is to talk to sort of exert pressure on our ministries of education. Because what happens is you've got a very Eurocentric, slavish minister of education. They appoint the vice chancellors or the rectors or the presidents of universities. And the rectors appoint deans of faculties and heads of departments. So the whole Eurocentric structure is perpetuated, and all we can do as autonomous individuals is we can teach differently, which may have some influence, but not a whole lot of influence on the curriculum in general.
Thank you very much, Professor. As a final question, and I think this is a fitting final question to both of you, comes from Timothy. How much impact do sociologists have on contemporary society, and do we need more policymakers to be influenced by sociological thinking to improve society? In borders on practice, borders on, well, as you mentioned, Professor Alatas, policy. So your thoughts?
So should I go?
Yes.
Yeah. There is a lot of research done on the impact that sociologists and other social scientists have on policy making. And of course, the impact is not just on policy making; it's also on on society in general. And some fields in sociology are more impactful than others. And sociology is also more impactful in certain countries than in others. I think it's certainly more impactful in the US, in the UK, in some European societies than in Southeast Asia, for example. And also depends on the field. So for example, sociology education in the UK has been very impactful in terms of policy, and sociology of health has also been relatively more impactful than say other areas in sociology. But I think we have to make a distinction between the impact of sociology on policy, in which sociologists are engaged in one way or another with the policy making process, whether to critique policy or to be working with government to formulate and implement policies in certain areas, as opposed to the role of sociologists in terms of conscientizing people beyond the campus. I think there certainly is, it's not a question that we can answer for all, in general, because the situation is very different depending on the society that you live in. I know that in the case of Malaysia, there has been a revival of various, a revival of interest in various issues compared to the time when I was a kid. So, for example, there's a revival of interest in socialism among the youth in Malaysia, and this is off campus, not on campus. So here you have a role for sociologists who are interested to engage these youth, and that is taking place. The youth are also engaged nowadays, and this is happening. I'm sure it's the same in the Philippines, but it's happening throughout Malaysia and Indonesia. The rise of indie presses. A lot of young people are, engaged in the publishing industry, publishing works that they can't necessarily find in the more established presses, and they're looking for works to publish, works that deal with interests that they have on socialism, on racism, on religion and Marxism, on affirmative action and these kinds of things. I think if you look at what's happening in society, the main thing is to look beyond campus, look at what's happening outside there in society. We will find groups, NGOs, collectives, which have similar interests as we do, and we need to connect with them.
Thank you, Prof. Alatas. Prof. Vinita, thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's a short answer to the question is yes, of course. Enlightened policy making will lead to a better society, and certainly the sociological knowledge that is produced has the potential from which one can derive enlightened policies. But I also want to say that I don't think the point is that everyone should become a policymaker, or that all of us should do research that has an explicit policy-making dimension, right? I think that's one route, but the other route, which I think is a broader route, is to say that sociological knowledge has the potential from which one can abstract lessons for enlightened policy-making, and that's certainly something that we should do. So I think to that end, it's really important to figure out what are the different mechanisms and strategies through which important sociological knowledge that is being produced can be communicated and disseminated and made available to policymakers who are keen to think through the complexities of issues that we are facing in society. I sort of wanted to come back to Ramabai a little bit, and in her book, The High Caste Hindu Woman, there's a final chapter that she's written, and the final chapter is called How the Condition of Women Tells Upon Society, right? And this is it's a very progressive and a very kind of a modernist position to hold, because she argues, and this is a remarkable insight for a woman living in the middle of the 19th century, right? That women's status and their treatment by society is an index of the broader structural and institutional ethos of any society, right? And she argued that a society cannot progress until it acknowledged the unjust and inhumane treatment that is doled out to the most vulnerable and oppressed members of society, including women. So she makes a really powerful statement in the text about how the degradation of women affected not just women, but also men, since their existence is mutually interdependent and shapes the future of that society. So, I think there is potential here in Ramabai's writings of seeing a kind of a direct connection between the condition of women and what she calls the state of the nation, right? And I think this kind of idea is what we want to absolutely, disseminate, as Farid has mentioned, both in academic quarters and beyond, right? So I think the challenge is really to see how the very good work that sociologists are doing, can be made available in a mode and a tone and a language that policymakers would want to pay attention to. Because very often a lot of sociological work is dismissed as too theoretical and too abstract, right? And I think it's important for sociologists to insist on the societal impact, the potential societal impact of the work we do, provided the analysis that we offer is followed through. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinha. On that note, we would like to thank our two guest speakers for this afternoon, Professor Said Farid Alatas and Professor Vidita Sinha, for generously sharing their time with us. It has been a productive engagement, and I hope that our participants had a lot of takeaways to bring along with them as far as the role of Asian social thinkers and reformers are concerned, and as far as in a more general perspective, as far as sociology's role and position in the world is concerned. So on that note, thank you very much, Professor Sinha, Professor Alatas, for your time. Immensely appreciate your insights and your engagement with our webinar participants. So stay tuned for more engagement such as this. This has been Nino Leviste, webinar convener and facilitator for this afternoon. So good afternoon, take care, and have a pleasant week ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.